Hey, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the AI Guide. I'm really happy to have Timothy Kenny with us today. Timothy has courses on Skillshare and Udemy, and Timothy is the author of Accelerated Learning for Entrepreneurs. He teaches classes and speaks to groups about how to accelerate their learning. Also, Timothy is taught at the Harvard Innovation Lab, the Tufts University Entrepreneur Society, General Assembly in Boston, and has been a featured teacher on Skillshare, among others. So Timothy has worked with a lot of folks the age of my audience, which is 18 to 34. And welcome, Timothy.
Thanks. Good to be here.
So how did you first get interested in coding?
I have to think for a second. I mean, I always knew that it was something valuable, that with technology, with the internet, it was good to know how to code, but it always seemed mysterious to me. It always seemed like it was kind of a foreign language and it was mathematical. One person that inspired me is Scott H. Jung. He did the MIT challenge. He took the 4-year computer science program all online through MIT's open courseware. And he did that all in a year. So did the entire 4-year curriculum in 1 year, did all the homework sets, uploaded his work, took the tests, uploaded his results of the test. And so that was inspiring to me. And I thought, I'm going to give this a shot. I just kept on kind of doing it for a month and then giving up, and then doing it for a month and giving up and coming back to it. And I tell people now, if you want to learn how to code, start with learning Excel or Google Sheets, because it's really that simple. You're using programming to just sort of do things in batch mode. It's that example of adding up two numbers together with a sum in Google Sheets or Excel, and that adds two numbers together. Then you can drag and drop and do 1,000 of those, and the computer will instantly do that 1,000 times. And that's where the power of programming comes, is the computer will just do the same thing over and over again. And a factory is the same way. So Elon Musk has talked about the gigafactory and how it's one large machine. Any big factory is run by computers and just stamps out the same product over and over and over again. And that's programming as well. So whether you're giving instructions to a computer or to a human or to another kind of animal, it's the same basic process. So when you're training that dog to go fetch something or roll over or whatever, sit, those are commands, those are instructions. And the computer, the person, or the dog processes those instructions, and then hopefully they follow the instructions. But it's really that simple. And then also, I play football, and with my brothers, I'd usually play quarterback. And so the quarterback giving instructions to the team in the huddle and then going out and executing that's another form of running a play, running a command, running a set of instructions and memorizing those instructions, and everybody working together kind of like a choreography. So you need to write it in a language that can only be interpreted in one way. And so you have to sort of clarify your thinking so you can get to the point where you can speak in that kind of formal or very structured language.
Great. And what kind of coding do you teach in your course?
So for the most part, my courses are actually meant to be an on-ramp. So to take people who always felt like they weren't going to be able to code, or it's too difficult, it's too complicated, and get them just understanding the basic concepts. Because I remember, and I'm somebody who did pretty well in math growing up and was in advanced courses and everything. And so I was a little bit surprised and disappointed in myself that it was still quite difficult for me. Kind of reminded me when I was in high school being a lifeguard, and I was the slowest swimmer on the team. And I was just, maybe there's something where I just can't get it, but I just kept on trying. And I've taught a lot, and I know how to teach, and I know how people learn and all the intricacies of it. And what I've noticed over and over again is that people teaching these programming courses will use vocabulary that their students would have no reason to understand. So they're speaking to their students in a foreign language, assuming the student should know that. When you speak to a computer and you give the computer command, it doesn't know what it is. It just doesn't do anything. And so one of my key things with teaching is you never use a word that your students don't already know. You have to only build with the Lego blocks that you're given. You can't just invent a new Lego block and start building with that. So you have to know, what do my students know, and then use those materials to build up the concepts that you want to do. And I just saw over and over again, and there's a bit of a stereotype that people in the hard sciences are not as good communicators with people, and they tend to not have as good communication or teaching skills. So that could be part of it. There could be sort of a theory of mind component of that. And I think that's necessary. You have to be able to really get inside the head of your student and understand, what does this person know? What level are they at? And make sure whatever you're doing is at that level. We see in government policies and laws now, plain language policies, plain language laws, which require things not be written at more than like a 5th grade or an 8th grade level. So that's an example of that. But I think if teachers would just focus on that, that would improve things so much. But it's really rampant. And I'm talking about the most popular courses out there on how to learn Python, how to learn, C++, how to learn Java, like the basic things where you should have competent teachers, and just for the most part, you don't. And if you're missing one little concept, then you're already kind of struggling, because it's tough stuff, and you never used a command line before. You're having, anybody who's tried to install Python before, it never goes right the first time. It usually doesn't go right the second time. There's usually something that just doesn't work or is incompatible, or you have to know this little checkbox to uncheck or whatever. It's surprising how bad it is in programming specifically. And so that's what I wanted to focus on, because I also realize I don't want to necessarily be a programmer or software developer. I want to think more about at the architectural level, and I want to be able to hire somebody who can build what I want, and I want to give them the basic architecture of how I think it maybe should be built. But it doesn't make sense for the business that I'm in to be actually doing the coding most of the time myself. And if you don't want to be an in-depth developer coder, you can still be very valuable as a project or product manager, where you're communicating between the business side and the software developer side. So knowing code isn't just valuable. I think everybody should have basic skills in Excel, basic to intermediate skills. It's such a huge advantage, and it's going to show up in so many areas of your life, just keeping stuff organized. So I think everybody should have that. But then going beyond that, I think you decide based on what you want to do for your career.
Yeah, that's terrific. And that's great that your courses are designed to be an on-ramp, because that is probably exactly where most of the people who are my viewers would be interested. So that's great. At that point, after you did a class on coding, if that was your first one, I don't even know. But if it was, what then led you to go into creating courses regarding productivity and planning and some of the other things that you've put together to teach?
Yeah, so the programming course, I should have mentioned this before, but the key metaphor throughout is, and I had a conversation with a cousin of mine, and we were talking about her young children and just sort of how important computer science and programming, and it made me realize that, like, most people don't understand this stuff. They don't understand where the world is going. They don't understand, Paul Graham said computer science is eating everything. They don't
Yeah.
see the tidal wave coming. And so I realized I need to make this something that anybody, even a child, could understand. And so I use the metaphor of cooking and being a chef in a kitchen and a restaurant. And so the chef gives instructions to the other cooks. The recipe book is a collection of instructions, and it has a recipe, which is procedural. It also has the individual ingredients. And so in that example, the recipe book or cookbook writer is the programmer. The chef is the computer, and the cookbook writer or author is writing the instructions that the chef is going to execute. And the chef can make one filet mignon, or they can make 1,000 filet mignons. They're going to follow that same recipe every time. And the power of a computer is you give it that one thing and it'll do it over and over and over and over and over again. And so that's, I think, actually the key benefit of, and I even talk about the front end and the back end. So the back end of your sort of server code is, or just the back end of your software is the kitchen, and then the front end is the dining area. And so the people who design the front end and the UX and the HTML and the CSS and the JavaScript, they're working, and JavaScript now is backend also, but it kind of gives you an example of like, okay, the people that work in the front end and they're, you know, versus the people that work in the back, and they're both following, you know, the maitre d' will have some kind of script maybe of how they greet people who enter the restaurant, and the waiter or waitress will have a certain way of greeting. There'll be a process for handling the billing at the end. All of those things can be mapped onto what happens with programming and with software. And everybody's gone to a restaurant. Everybody knows how a restaurant works. And so that's what I think is really special about it. And I spent a lot of time really trying to make sure that it's like Aesop's fables. You need to have a matching analog or metaphor between each side of the story. So that was that course. And I actually that's not where I got started. So I got started in accelerated learning. I knew in high school, I read the 4-Hour Work Week. I knew I wanted to do some kind of entrepreneurial thing, some kind of start a business. So I'm teaching myself business. I'm reading business books, taking business courses. And one day I'm at a conference, I'm telling people about this book I just read, and I realized, and I felt so smart. I felt like, oh, wow, like sometimes you have that experience when you've read a really good book and your mind is just buzzing with ideas and you feel like, oh, I'm now a genius on this topic. So I'm walking around like this, and I'm at this conference, and somebody asked me, oh, what are the top 2 or 3 things you learned? And I couldn't even come with one thing. And so it threw me for a loop, because when I was in school, it was all about cramming for tests, and I would do quite well. And so it was like sort of getting knocked on my back and being like, wow, I thought I was here and I'm actually way down here. And so I said, I'm going to spend a month, stop learning business and just learn how to learn. I'm going to learn about speed reading, note taking, memory. I thought that at the time that was the trifecta. And so I did that. And then I realized as I was doing that, wow, like most of the stuff out here on this stuff is not that good. I could just put together a summary and it would be better than 80 or 90% of the stuff out there. And hey, this could be a good business idea. Maybe, I can do something with this. So when I started that idea of I wanted to start a business, I didn't know what my product or service was going to be. I was thinking luck is when preparation meets opportunity. You prepare yourself and then you start seeing the opportunities all around you. And so I was just preparing myself, came up upon this problem of, hey, I'm not remembering what I'm learning. And that led me to where I am today. So that expanded out into productivity, because once I had figured out accelerated learning, then it was, well, how should I manage my time? How should I schedule things? How should I do short, medium, long-term planning? And then how should I organize my papers? How should I organize my books? How should I organize the files on my computer? Like really basic life skills. And I went around and looked for answers to this stuff. And again, I found the same issue of most of the stuff out there isn't that good. And then at a deeper level, for whatever reason, people are not taking this that seriously. I said, I need to come up with a system for myself. And that's what a lot of my courses are, is coming up with something that I needed for myself anyways. And since I started coaching, I'll come up with things for clients and then I'll turn that into a course. I had this conversation with my cousin and I realized, wow, this is something that's really needed. And I'd always kind of had that interest in learning how to program. And since then I've hired a coach and I've hired people to program stuff for me. I've worked with people in machine learning and AI to build stuff. And we'll get into this later in the podcast, the sort of flip side of it. But the programming stuff was actually later in my career, and it wasn't even something I was really trying to make money with. I thought, this could blow up. It's like sometimes somebody writes a children's book and for whatever reason it just blows up. But it hasn't been, I wouldn't say it's been hugely popular, but it's kind of something I just wanted to do. And so that's why it's out there.
Yeah, that's great. And I love the analogy that you used between a kitchen and cooking and coding. That's a great analogy. And I'm also very glad that you mentioned the coming tidal wave, because this is what triggered me to start the AI guide. It took me a couple of years to get there after I started going to AI conferences. But when I would hear people who are like the head of AI at Facebook and Alphabet and stuff like that talk, and then it really started to sink in just how transformative this was going to be for all aspects of society. And before we started, we were talking a little bit, and we were talking about how this is going to broadly impact everyone in society. And we were talking first about, um, jobs like driving a truck or an Uber or something like that. And then we also started talking about how it's going to also have an impact on the white collar side. So give us your thoughts on the impact that you see coming.
So I want to go back to the AI thing for a second, because you have to be careful in tech and AI with buzzwords. And AI is actually a buzzword. So it's become naturalized. Machine learning, kind of the same thing. Machine learning is really statistics. AI is just statistics plus logic. These things have been around for 70 plus years.
Mhm.
And they were around before computers. You had armies of secretaries in huge rooms at desks lined up, like hundreds in a huge room, just adding numbers together, calculating things by hand or with some kind of abacus or something. People have had these procedures, and the things that these computers are doing of adding things together, subtracting things, replacing things, these little minute tasks, humans used to do those, and they would just have these huge rooms of people doing all this stuff very laboriously, very slowly. So and somebody was figuring out, what do I tell this army of people in this room to do? Like, how are they going to calculate these things and then add it up all together? I think one of the earliest examples with the punch cards was doing the census. And so
Yeah.
you think about the census, we still have people go around, collect information. You can't just have a Google form and collect that information. You have to have a person go out and sort of do it. So it's important not to get caught up with the buzzwords of machine learning and AI, because there's marketing people and business people who need to sort of romance the stone and figure out ways to sell this stuff to other people who have no idea what AI and machine learning or computer stuff is. You need to be careful about that. And underlying all this stuff is the same kind of math that's been around and logic that's been around for thousands of years. And so don't get too distracted by that. But your original question was, sorry, I lost track.
Well, I was saying, and quickly to what you were just saying, the movie Hidden Figures showed a lot of that at NASA, where the women were doing
Yep.
everything with manual calculations. Very impressive. But my question was, we had started talking briefly about the impact of AI, and I was wondering your take on that.
The big thing in the last 10 or 20 years with AI is this statistical aspect of things. And it's just like how your brain has two sides. You have the logic, sort of reasoning side, and you have the intuitive side. And the two come together, and there's certain problems that one side does better, certain problems that the other side does better. The side that's more emotional will be good at things like a baseball is coming to you at 95 miles an hour and you need to hit that baseball, or you need to react in a split second, or you need to say, oh, that reminds me of this other thing. Whereas the logic and reasoning has to do with math, has to do with logic, has to do with piecing things together. And oh, that causes that, or if I do that, then that leads to these two other things, or that thing, then there's these three other possible ways that could have led to this thing. So both are useful for solving different types of problems. And more recent AI is how do we have that intuitive component? So self-driving cars are a really good example. And these are called neural nets. And they're based off of how neurons interconnect in the brain, where it's just sort of a mesh. It's sort of a very ball of yarn kind of thing. Like there's just all these interconnections, and they basically come together to, I don't have a good way of explaining it in the moment, but they form statistical patterns, kind of like how ants on the floor of the jungle, they'll naturally find paths on the lower or clearer areas, and then they'll use those as sort of little superhighways. So your brain finds those kind of things and creates statistical patterns. And so neural nets are just an equivalent to that. And so we may come to this later. The kind of human side that I focus on with accelerated learning is called intelligence augmentation. So it's kind of the reverse of AI. And it's about taking the innovations of AI and bringing those into how do humans learn? How can humans think better, think more clearly? So we can come back to that later. But with AI, it's really a form of psychology. It's a form of formalized psychology where you're modeling the human mind and you're trying to model it with algorithms and data structures. So you have the logic type of stuff like in a spreadsheet where it's just adding things. It's very regimented, and that was like early computers. And then more recently, you have these statistical things that can mimic the very organic process of how do you create associations. So a good example of this actually is you'll get those CAPTCHAs where it's like, prove that you're not a robot. And you have to pick out the bus or the boat or the tree or the traffic light. Why do they want you to do that? Because if they show millions of people, millions of pictures of traffic lights at every single different possible angle, and cars and trucks and boats at every single possible angle, they feed that into a computer and it learns by association statistical patterns. Oh, this is what a truck looks like. This is what a boat looks like. And it's each frame of the video that self-driving car sees, it's like, oh, that's most likely to be a traffic light. That's most likely to be a stop sign. That's most likely to be a car. That's most likely to be a truck. And so you feed the algorithm thousands and millions of examples of something, and it gets good enough at recognizing it that it can be useful, that it makes an error 1 in a million or 1 in a billion times. And so in the same way, when you're learning a new language and you're trying to say the word the right way, or you're learning new people's faces at the office, it takes a few times for your brain to like intuitively get it. And then you get it. And so in the same way, your brain has that organic process of coming up with whatever that is, that sort of intuition. And the machine learning side of AI is about capturing that same kind of intuition in a computer using statistical processes. It's important to understand those are the two key pieces, and any type of problem you're trying to solve with AI, you're figuring out, does it fit into this logic side, where I just need to write like a very complicated recipe, or it's kind of like the chef taking a little spoon and tasting and be like, put a little sprinkle more pepper or salt into that, and they're not even really measuring it, but they've got that sense of like, yeah, this tastes like grandma's tomato sauce, or tastes a little off, maybe add a little this, a little that. So those are the two different kinds of AI. That's the big split in the middle of the kinds of problems AI's used to solve.
Great, great. So with your courses, what do you have coming up? What are you working on next? Or is it a continuation of one of the series you've already started?
Yeah, so my first set of courses, which you mentioned, Skillshare and Udemy, that's where I put kind of my first draft, my first iteration, version 1.0 of each of my courses. And what I'm doing now is creating premium versions of all of those courses. And most of those courses came out 3 to 4 years ago. And so I've developed a lot of stuff since then. The way I think about those courses is they're kind of like my summary of the best stuff that I'd gathered from a lot of different sources. I had done a little bit of innovation, but not a huge amount. And for this new crop of stuff, some of them have already come out, some of them will be coming out in the next year or two. Um, it falls under, it started with planning. So my planning course is called Presidential Planning. And the reason why it's called Presidential Planning is because once I got the course that's on Udemy and Skillshare out, it was about daily, weekly, monthly, quarterly, and yearly planning. And so then the next question was, how do you do multi-year planning? How do you do 20, 50, 100-year planning? And so I went out and looked for people teaching this stuff. And of course, nobody teaches that.
Right.
So
At least here
then,
in the US, yeah.
yeah. So, you can go to an estate planner or a state lawyer. They can sort of talk about certain things. But in terms of a full featured lifelong plan or even multi-generational, the only people that do that are large companies, Fortune 500 companies, and then countries.
Mhm.
And so I started looking at, oh, well, how does the US government plan out the next 20, 50, 100 years? What do the presidents have their 100-day plan and their 4-year plan or their 8-year plan? So I started looking into this stuff and I found a lot of interesting stuff. And so I started developing this concept of how do you look at this from the presidential level, sort of being the president of your own life and thinking very holistically. The other thing that I didn't like about business planning is that it wasn't holistic. It just looks at how do I achieve my bottom line. But we all know that a life is not fully lived just by the bottom line. It's lived by holistic of the different areas of your life. And with my mastering organization course, that was the crown jewel of that course. That course has this taxonomy in it that covers all the different areas of your life, all the different functional areas, your professional, personal, relationships, health, and then subcategories within each of those. And that's what really makes that course special, is that system. And so I felt like with planning, business planning doesn't get at those other factors. They're just seen as sort of at most inputs into the business process. They're human resources. But your friends, your family, they're not just human resources, they're part of your life. And focusing on your body and making sure your body is good, your relationships, your personal life, your spiritual life. So all of those things need to be part of a holistic plan. And so that's what I like about government planning, is that it needs to look at some of these things that are not just about how much money you're making. It's about all those other factors. And so it gave me a great framework to start with. And then I've adapted it from then. And I've come up with an acronym called PESTLE-TIM, PESTLE dash TIM. And it stands for political, economic, social, technological, legal, environmental, time, information, and military. So this is a holistic, and PESTLE, the PEST and then PESTLE has been used in government and business for a long time. And there's like 10 different versions of this acronym. And so I took all 10 versions. I said, how can I combine the little additions that different people made to this into one sort of comprehensive one that captures all the different variables? And so that's where PESTLE-TIM comes from. And that's the framework when you're looking at your planning. You're deciding what's my plan for each of these different areas, and you're analyzing a situation. You're looking at what are the variables within this dimension, what are the variables within this dimension, what are the variables within this dimension. And that's how you make sure your plan is comprehensive and your situational awareness is comprehensive. So if you're a radiologist and you're thinking about getting into radiology and AI may eat your lunch in 10 years or 20 years or 5 years, then you haven't been looking at that technological component enough. So you need to look at all of these components and make sure, do I understand what's happening now, what's happening in the future in this area? So then I sort of got interested in the presidency. One president in particular has had an influence on me for a long time, which is President Eisenhower. And that was all based on the interstate highway system. So I did this whole road trip thing when I was younger, going around the country. And I just learned about the country. I learned about going on the interstates, but I actually avoided the interstates most of the time and want to go on the local roads. Because when you're on the interstate, it's just McDonald's after McDonald's, after Walmart, after Wendy's, after McDonald's. You don't even really feel like you're in a different place. You're in the same kind of hermetically sealed corporate arteries of the country. And so I went on what's called the blue highways, which are the old sort of before the interstates, where you get to see the local scenery and the local shops and towns, and a lot of them are shuttered now. It's just sort of a ghost town. So that was really interesting, but I learned the background of how the interstate system was built and just sort of all the benefits that came with it. And we also now know some of the drawbacks of it, but um, that was really influential on me of systems. And so as I learned about the presidential system of planning, and also just the day to day, how does the president plan their day? They get the presidential daily brief. They get nighttime reading. They get a booklet of stuff that they read. And I talk about all this in my separate course called Think Like a POTUS, which gets into thinking skills. And that those are kind of the four verticals that I focus on. Thinking skills is the most recent one, but it's learning, planning, organizing, and thinking skills. And so the organization course looks at how is the government organized? How do you create sort of a personal government for your own life? How is the White House residence organized, which has about 100 workers in it, and the different functions and tasks that they do, and making sure all the different systems in your household and in your overall life are handled by somebody. And you have a place to put information related to each one of them. And then presidential learning is the next stage of my learning system. So that's kind of, I wanted to look at, so Eisenhower was a great systematizer. He brought a lot of new systems into the White House when he became president. He was supreme allied commander of the headquarters in Europe and during World War II. And so he was a great organizer, and he brought those organization skills to the White House and built a lot of systems that are still used today. So I thought that was just really interesting, sort of Eisenhower being this great systematizer, and how that's benefited the White House and the presidency. And so I wanted to bring that same sort of thinking to how can you improve the organization, the processes you have when you're fulfilling a similar role. The special thing about the president is the president has to be that most holistic decision maker that takes all the inputs from all the different areas of public and private life and ultimately makes those tough decisions. The buck stops here. That's Truman. So you have that same kind of position in your own life where you have to make those very holistic decisions. And that's why the presidency is better as a model than a CEO or a chairman, because it is very holistic. And we've seen with COVID how the presidency is more than just, making individual decisions. It's about balancing a lot of very difficult to balance things. And same thing with companies. Should we let people work from home? Should we make people come in? So we've had a reckoning as a country and as a world with that. But at the presidency, you really see all these different factors you have to balance. So I think it's a great model to look at for your own personal planning and organization and learning.
That's really cool. So where can my viewers find your premium courses?
You just go to timothykenny.com. That's TIMOTHYKENNY, and just sign up to my email list. I do stuff through launches. And so you just get on my newsletter, and then once or twice a year, I'll do a cohort of a certain course, and you sign up, and then over a 4-week or 8-week period or whatever, you go through the course.
Cool. And what kind of time commitment is involved once you're in one of these cohorts?
It kind of depend on the course, but I'd say maybe 3 to 5 hours a week.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Great. Great. Yeah. And how can my viewers, other than your newsletter, keep up with what you're doing and stay in touch with you?
I've got a YouTube channel, so just put Timothy Kenny into YouTube. I'm on Twitter as well, Timothy_Kenny. So those are the best ways to stay in touch and keep up with what I'm doing.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming on. You've really worked on some very interesting things, and I appreciate you taking the time to come and speak to us and let our viewers know what you're up to. So thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks for having me.